Today's daf is Ayin Gimel, and we're on the bottom of Ayin Beis Amid Beis, and we were trying to derive the conclusion that even in a case of a Minchas Siorim, which fit under two categories, there's the Minchas Knos for Sota, and there's a Minchas HaOmer, both of which are brought from barley, from Siorin, and now we have to know whether or not in these cases the same halacha applies that applies to a classic mincha of a minchas chita, and that means that the Kohen does kmitza in these two cases of minchas siorin, and the shirayim are eaten by the Kohen. And the Gemara tried to derive that from a pasuk of kol mincha blula b'shemen v'charev l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. And the Gemara applied the principle that we discussed yesterday called the Me'eno Inyan. So now the Gemara is going to ask the following on the bottom of Ayin Beis Amid Beis V'Hayla Hachi Hu Da'asa. Are you using that pasuk for teaching you that there's kmitza and heter achila shirayim? Hami boile sanya. I need this pasuk for that which is taught in a brisa. Minayin she'ein cholki menachos keneged zvachim. So it works like this. The Kohanim have monetary rights to the basar of karbonos and also to the shirayim of menachos. Now, one Kohen turns to another and he says, let's make a barter, let's make an exchange. You take my chelik in a mincha and I'll take your chelik in a zevach, meaning in a shchitas behema. And the Torah prohibits this. And now we're going to start today's daf Ayin Gimel. Talmud Lomar, how do we know that the Torah prohibits this kind of a barter exchange? V'chol mincha asher te'ofe batanur l'chol bnei Aaron tia ish ke'achiv. So in the parsha of Menachos, the Torah says that it's l'bnei Aaron, meaning it's theirs. The whole pasuk reads, "V'chol mincha asher te'ofe betanur v'chol nase b'marcheshes v'al machvas la'koin ha'makavosa lo sia." And from that pasuk, we derive the conclusion that since it says in the pasuk l'chol b'nei Aaron tia, that's going to teach me that all the Kohanim have rights to eat from the mincha, and no Kohen is allowed to make a barter deal to give up his chelik in the mincha. The Brisa says, okay, so that's a case where one Kohen has rights to the mincha, and the other Kohen has the rights to a zevach. Yochel lo yachleku menachos keneged zvachim. Maybe this is limited only to the case where the swap is between a mincha and a zevach. Shelo kamu tachteim v'dalus. Right, we have a carbon which is called a carbon ola v'yored. And what happens is there are three levels. If you're wealthy enough, you'll bring a zevach, a behema. If you're not wealthy enough to afford a keves or whatever it might be, then you bring ophos. And then if you can't afford even a bird, then you bring a mincha. So it turns out that in that hierarchy, it's the oath that could be an exchange, a replacement for a zevach, for an animal, if he can't afford the animal. But there's no direct relationship between the zevach and the mincha. So therefore, the zevach and the mincha, as demonstrated by the carbon olive yored, is so far removed one from the other that therefore you can't make an exchange. I might think therefore that since an oaf, Sharei Kamu Tachtem Dallas, in the case of a poor person, he can bring a bird instead of an animal, and therefore the Zvachim and the Ophos are very closely related because the Oph could replace the Zevach, and therefore I might think that two Kohanim could get together and decide and agree on an exchange in which Ruvain will give Shimon his right to the Zevach, and Shimon in turn will give Ruvain his right to the oath. Talmud Lomar v'chol nasa b'marcheshes l'chol b'nei Aaron tia. Again, the pasuk says l'chol b'nei Aaron tia, and the extra pasuk of l'chol b'nei Aaron tia is now going to teach me that even in the second level of exchanging a zevach for an oath, even that is prohibited. Yochel, I might think lo yachlechu menachos keneged ophos. Shalolu minei domim v'alolu minei kmachim. The distance that separates between a mincha and an oaf is so profound because the mincha is subject to kmitza, but obviously there's no domim. Whereas in the case of an oaf, there's mitzui dam. So because of that radical differentiation and contrast between the ophos and the menachos, therefore you cannot allow for an exchange oaf for a mincha. Is yachleku ophos keneged zvachim. But then I wanted to suggest now, says the Brisa, that we can make an exchange for ophos and zvachim because halolu mini domim, because both in the case of a zevach there's a zrikas dam on the mizbeach, and in the case of an oath there's mitzui dam on the mizbeach. And since halolu mini domim, there's certain close affinity between the carbon of an oath and the carbon of a zevach. Therefore, I could allow for an exchange one for the other. Talmud Lomar v'al machvas l'chol b'nei Aaron tia. And once again, we're deriving from this pasuk that since we don't need the pasuk for machvas, we're going to use it in a different context. That you cannot have an exchange between the portion of an oath and the portion of an animal. I understand that ophos and zvachim are separated one from the other. And why is that? Because with regard to a zevach, we need shchita with a knife. Shalol asiyosem biyad. But in the case of an oath, there's malika that substitutes for shchita, and there's no use of any klishares, balolu. But on contrast, in the case of an animal, is asiyosem bekli. But let's say I want to swap my mincha, my chelik as a kohen, with your chelik as a kohen in another mincha. In both cases, there's kmitza biyad and there's no kli, there's no knife. Is Talmud Lomer v'chol mincha. This is the pasuk now that we're leading up to, which we had used this pasuk to teach us kmitza and heter shirayim l'kohen. But we're using now this pasuk v'chol mincha blula b'shemen l'chol b'nei Aaron tia to derive the conclusion that you cannot swap even a mincha for a mincha. Yachol lo yachleku machvas keneged marcheshes. Marcheshes keneged machvas. So we have two types of menachos. One is the machvas that's made on a flat pan. That's the hard kind of matzah. And the other is marcheshes, which is a deep pan with lots of oil so that the dough is suffused with liquids, and therefore it leads to a softer product. Umarcheshes keneged machvas, shezo asiyoseh b'koshim, zu maser rachim. One is soft and the other is hard. So these are two fundamentally different kinds of menachos. Avol yachleku machvas keneged machvas, marcheshes keneged marcheshes. If your chelik is in a machvas and mine is likewise in a machvas, or alternatively yours in a marcheshes, mine in a marcheshes, then we would allow a swap one for the other. Talmud Lomar, again, we're going to derive from the pasuk v'chareva l'chol b'nei Aaron tia. And l'chol b'nei Arantia means you have to guarantee that the Kohen has his chelik and he doesn't give it up. Yachol lo yachleku b'kodshei kadoshim. Maybe this prohibition applies only in kodshei kodshim, like ola or chatos or osham. Aval yachleku b'kodshim kalim. But when it comes to something like shlomim or Pesach or Toda or Maser, so there it's only kodshim kalim. Maybe in kodshim kalim, since it's less severe, therefore, the Torah would allow and recognize a swap. You take my chelik in the shlomim, and I'll take your chelik in the shlomim. Talmud lomer ish ke'echa achiv ve'im al toda. So we see the pasuk is equating it to toda. Kishem shein cholkim v'kodshei kodshim, kach ein cholkim v'kodshim kalim. So basically, there's an absolute prohibition under all circumstances of swapping one chelik for another. Now we go on, and since we quoted the pasuk Ish ke'achiv, what do we derive from that? Ish cholek afilu balmum. So even though a balmum, a kohen balmum is pasul avoda, but nevertheless he does have rights to get the chelik in the basar. V'ein katan cholek afilu b'tam. But a katan, even if he doesn't have any mum, and he's a kohen, but nevertheless he cannot get a part of the offerings. So now we go back to our original question, and how do we know that even in the cases of Minchas Sa'orim, we can derive the conclusion from this very same pasuk that this Kmitza and Heter Shirayim, this pasuk is being used to derive the conclusion that the Kohen cannot exchange his share in the carbon with another Kohen. So the Gemara answers, Ahu mi kol nafka. In other words, there's another additional word in the pasuk that we're going to use since it's superfluous, and that's the word kol. And it says kol mincha blula bashemen, and that extra word kol is going to teach me that whether or not it's a minchas chita or a minchas seora, in all cases, the halacha is that the mincha requires kmitza and there's a heter achilas hashirai. Gemara asks, "V'ha fikte likid Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda," and this is a sugya that we had back on Daf Samach Gimel of Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda, and that was the case of Minchas Mafe. And Rabbi Yossi derives from the word v'chol that the Minchas Mafe cannot be brought from 5 chalos and 5 rikikin, which was the shita of Rabbi Shimon. So now that we need that pasuk lafuke mi Rabbi Shimon, and to disqualify a carbon that's made up of 5 chalos and 5 rikikim, in the case of a minchas mafe, so I can't use that very same pasuk. I'm sorry, that even though I need that very same pasuk to teach me kmitza and heter shirayim, but nevertheless the additional word kol is free to teach me that there's no combination of 5 matos, otherwise called cholos, with 5 rikikin. So where are we up to now? We had Hahu Mikol Nafka. Now the Gemara is going to challenge that. Vafikte lichet Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. How can you tell me that you use the extra word kol to teach me that even in the case of a minchas siorin, we're going to apply the principle of kmitza and then het shirayim, and now we're going to derive it from the extra word kol, but ha fikte Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Right? So we needed, as we said before, to teach us not that you need kmitza and het shirayim applies to the minchas siorin, but rather to teach us that you cannot combine five in a mafet tanur. You cannot combine five chalos with five rikikim. Ella hu mivechal. So now we're going to darshan the vav. We have the word kol, and that's one drasha. And now we have an extra word, an extra letter vechal. And that's going to teach us that even a carbon of minchas siorin is subject to the same law of kmitz and heter shirayim. Okay, so at this point we have that Yalfusa, that pasuk from which we derive that even in the case of minchas siorim, the Kohen get to eat the shirayim. But now the Gemara wants to present an alternative source. Ravina Omar Asya Midatani Levi. This law that the minchas siorin, whether it's knos or it's the omer, the shirayim are eaten by the Kohen. That's derived from a different pasuk, from the brisa of Rabbi Levi. The Tani Levi taught us the following brisa: Kol karbonom l'chol karbonom l'chol minchasim l'chol chatasim l'chol ashomam. Apparently, each additional listing here is coming to be marbe, something that we would have excluded. So let's go through it one by one. It says kol karbonom. That's l'rabos log shemen shel mitzorah. Because once again, since the log shemen of mitzorah is not a mincha, it's not subject to kmitza and het shirayim. Therefore, I wouldn't know that even the log shemen of mitzorah is included in the matnas kahuna, meaning that there's shirayim after he does the application of the log shemen to the bohen of the kohen, etc., then leftover shemen belongs to the kohenim. And now the Gemara wants to explain why, according to Ravina and his presentation, we need a special ribui and a special pasuk for the shemen shel mitzorah. Salkadait, I mean, I would have thought, if not for this pasuk, that mina eish kasa rachman. In other words, those karbonos that are brought on the eish through Aktorah, they're the Kohen, since he's involved in all the avodah. The Torah gives him the benefit, I should say, of receiving the shirayim. But in the case of what? Of log shemen shel mitzorah, which doesn't go on the fire, it's being used for hazoya on the mitzorah at the end of his tzoras, is therefore in the case of log shemen shel mitzorah, I would have to I would have to have a pasuk to teach us that the shirayim of the log shemen goes to the Kohanim. Kamash Malan. Therefore, we have the pasuk of lechol kol karbonim to tell you that even in the case of the log shemen of Mitzorah, we're going to give the shirayim of the log shemen over to the Kohanim. L'chol minchasam, l'rabos minchas ha'omer, minchas knos. Now, why do we need a special derivation for these menachos? And the answer is because they come from barley and not from wheat. Salke, I would have thought, v'achlo, so much kupa behem rachmana, v'haila hater ka'asa, v'idach nami levara ka'asi. These two menachos that are brought from barley are unique in that they're both missing the element of kapara. In the case of the minchas ha'omer, the purpose of the mincha is not for kapara, but rather to be matir the teruach hadasha. And in the case of the minchas knos, the purpose of the mincha is not kapara because we don't even know that she's guilty, but rather levarer. It's there to determine whether or not she was guilty. And therefore, since of these two karbanos of siorim, we don't have an element of kapara. Therefore, I would say, you know what, the kohanim are not really doing all that much. I mean, they're functioning, but they're not bringing kapara for the person, and therefore the person, Baal HaKorban, doesn't owe anything to the kohanim, and therefore the shirayim will not be eaten by the kohanim. Kamash Malan. Therefore, the pasuk is going to teach us that the kohanim get their share and eat even in these menachos. And now the Brisa says, "L'chol chatosam l'rabos chatos ha'of," that even in chatos ha'of, the kohen gets the shirayim. Salke, why would I have thought that maybe chatos ha'of is different than every other korban? Is nevela because the bird is killed by the kohen with his thumbnail? Now, in the laws of hechsher basar, we need shchita to be matir midei nevela. Otherwise, the animal dies without shchita. Then it's a nevela. And here the Torah is telling us that even though the kohen will kill the bird, the chatas ha'of, with his malika, is therefore I might think that he cannot eat the shirayim. Kamash Malan. Let's just think about what's the logic here. That since the malika normally would be nevela, so I have a feeling that this ribuy for chatas ha'of is just telling you that the kohen is allowed to eat it. Once you're telling me that the kohen is allowed to eat it, then I would assume, like any other korban of its nature, that the kohen is allowed, has rights to eat it. Now, it's not just that he's allowed to eat it and it's not nevela, and he doesn't violate the Issa nevela, but also that he has rights to get his share in the shirayim. Then l'chol hashamam l'rabos asham nazir v'asham mitzorah. So the Gemara first says we have a pasuk for sham mitzorah. It said that yiksiv beiki chatos kosher hula kohen. So I know that all the dinim of chatos are superimposed onto asham. Hence, I would certainly conclude that the shirayim of a korban asham goes to the kohen. Fine. El Rabbos Hasham Nazir Kasham Mitzora. The Bryce is going to teach you. When it says L'chol Ashamam, that the Asham of a Nazir Tameh is subject to the same law that we give the Kohen his portion in this Hakrova. Salta, I would have thought that in the case of an Asham Nazir, Lahachshir Ka'asi, the whole purpose of the Korban Asham is to facilitate the Nazir's return to being a non-Nazir, which means he's allowed to drink wine, he's allowed to go into a Beis HaKvaros, and he's allowed to cut his hair. All this is lahachshir. That's the whole purpose of the Korban Asham. So once again, we're completely devoid or lacking in the element of kapara, and therefore maybe the Kohanim doesn't get to eat any portion of it. Kamash v'lan, that since it says l'chol ashamam, then it applies to every single asham, including the asham of a nazir. Now the Brisa concludes that asher yashivu ze gezel ager. So what happens is, if let's say Reuven steals money from a ger and the ger dies and leaves no yorshim, then the money goes to the kohanim. And how do we derive that? From the pasuk asher yashivu. Then the pasuk goes on and says, "Lecha hu ulevanecha, shalcha ulevanecha filu lekadish bo isha." Because normally, you cannot give something that has the status of hegdish to a woman and say, "Arei mekudesh to be mekadisha with that." But here, on the other hand, that which is being given to the kohen is not hegdish; it's just the result of hashavas gzela of a ger. So therefore, since it's not really a complete ownership of the gezel ager, because what shaykhs does this kohen have to the gezel ager? He's not a yorish. So therefore, even if the Torah allows him to eat the from the monies, let's say, or even the be'en, perhaps of that which was stolen, but it's not totally his. And the nafkamina is that he can't be Mekadesh and Isha with. Amar Rav Huna,